everyone. I formally declare this meeting of the Audit and Risk Committee of the City of Perth open. Due to the declaration of public health emergency and the existence of a state of emergency, tonight's meeting is being held via video conference in accordance with the Local Government Administration Regulations 1996 and is live streamed on the city's website. I would ask the CEO, Mr. Murray Jorgensen, to advise who is in attendance at this evening's meeting. Mr. Jorgensen.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just call the names, Council. Anthony Sharp, Bill Parker, Chris Kopek, Chris Noble, Darren Turner, Gary Clark, Karen Strachan, Mario Choldi, Michael Kent, Naloha Mendoza, Reshma Jamir Bacchus, Sarah Gosling, Scott Simpson, Siobhan Rippington, Tess Jackson, Vanessa Phillips, and that's the list.
Thank you very much. And do we have any apologies or leave of absence for this evening's meeting?
We have an apology from the Chair of Commissioners, Andrew Hammond, who is hoping to be here shortly online, but he is attending another West Australian Local Government Association meeting.
Thank you. And I think Commissioner Kosova as well is a late apology.
Thank you.
Item 3, do we have any questions from the public?
No, Commissioner.
And I take it there are no questions from the floor previously advised.
Correct.
Thank you. I'd now like to move to item 4, the confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting. Would somebody so move?
I'll move those.
Thank you, Mr. Morich, and I'll second from the floor. Is there any discussion? Mr. Morich?
Sorry, no, none for me.
Thank you. And I don't have any discussion on the minutes. I'll put the motion to the vote for the acceptance of the minutes, and all those in favour by show of hands.
Yes.
And nil against. The motion has been carried. Moving to item 5, correspondence. Is there any correspondence, Mr. Jorgensen?
No, Commissioner.
And moving to item 6, the disclosure of members' interests. Do any committee members or employees wish to disclose an interest and its nature in any item contained within the agenda? If so, would you please turn on your microphones and make the appropriate disclosure? So
Chair, could I please, I just think for absolute transparency, there's a corporate credit card policy that is being discussed today, and I hold a corporate credit card, so I just want to declare that interest, although I don't want to get I don't want to participate in the discussion on that, and I'd allow our General Manager Corporate Services to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Jorgensen. We'll note that declared conflict. There may be others who are holders of corporate credit cards as well, so we'll be mindful of that. Moving to matters for which the meeting may be closed. Are there any matters for which the meeting may be closed this evening, Mr. Jorgensen?
Yes, Commissioner. In accordance with Section 523(2) of the Local Government Act 1995, to preserve the confidentiality of attachment 8.5c, it is recommended all commissioners may go behind closed doors prior to giving this matter consideration.
Thank you. Well, we'll consider that when we get to that item.
Thank you.
Moving to item 8, these are the reports. Our first agenda item is agenda item 8.1, and this is against our internal audit plan for the year April 2020. Would somebody move the motion as outlined in the papers?
Rob Morris, Chair. Sorry.
Thank you, Rob.
I'll move that.
Thank you. The motion that the council approves the corporate credit cards review April 2020 completed as part of the internal audit plan for 2019-20 has been moved, and I'm happy to second that motion from the chair. We can now discuss this motion, noting the previous conflicts of interest. The actual corporate credit card review is at attachment 8.1A in the agenda, so I'll just move to that item now. Mr. Morich, do you have any questions or comments on this item?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I did have one question, just in relation to the use of credit cards. Can credit cards be used to purchase gift vouchers? I'm just interested in terms of whether they can, and if so, how that is, if they're used in such a fashion.
Perhaps if we refer that matter to Mr. Parker, please.
Thank you, Chair. That's probably a question that I would need to take on notice. I'm sorry, I don't have those details in front of me at the moment.
Does anyone else in attendance, are they able to assist us with answering that question, or shall we just take it on notice? We'll take that question on notice then. Thanks very much, Mr. Parker. Did you have any further questions, Mr. Morich?
No, that was it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just wanted to note that there are 4 medium findings with respect to this credit card audit. The sample testing was approximately half of the credit cards that are issued, if I'm correct. I was surprised that we only have 25 credit cards in the organisation, which seemed quite a small number. But of those, 4 out of the 12 sampled did relate to timeliness of acquittals, which ranged from 26 days to 47 days. I apologise if it was in the papers, but I was wondering, under the policy, what is the time given to acquit credit cards? Mr. Parker?
Thank you, Chair. I might have to ask one of our auditors in terms of some detail around that policy, if that's okay, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Choldy?
Yes, Mario Curley, Internal Auditor, City of Perth. The procedure is a little bit unclear on this point, and that's one of the recommendation one, that clarity is needed on the timeliness of the acquittal timeline. I think the procedure from memory states any transactions before the 22nd of the month, which is the cut-off date for statements, needs to be approved and acquitted to the effect of about the second working day of the following month. So it's a little bit unclear.
Okay.
At the moment, and it's one of the elements in the recommendation to get clarity on that. I think the finance team are looking at more end of a month from the statement cut off as the desired goal.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Childy. So, that was my only question that I had relating to that audit. Obviously, the finance team is committed to reviewing the process and to addressing those 4 medium findings. So, on that basis, if there's no further discussion, I'll put the motion to the vote, and all those in favour, show of hands. Thank you. Nil against. The motion has been carried. Moving now to agenda item 8.2. This is the City of Perth Internal Audit Plan for 2020-2021. Would somebody move the motion relating to 8.2? And the recommendation is, excuse me, I'm just moving around the papers.
Perhaps I can help, Chair. The recommendation just says that Council approves the City of Perth Internal Audit Plan 2020-21 as per attachment 8.2A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jorgensen. So that motion has been moved, Mr. Morich, and
I'll Chair. Yeah, I'll move it. Yes.
Thank you, and I'll second from the Chair. Mr. Morich, do you have any questions or comments on this item?
First of all, I should just probably note that I did sit down with Ms. Childy in terms of the formulation of the plan, so I provided some input into the plan's formulation. So I think that's been reflected in the papers. I think it addresses some of the key areas that were on tenders, which I think was also incorporated into the plan as well. The question I had was just in relation to the tenders, and my question was really around if we're considering the fact that that we need an audit in tenders and there's been an increase in the around those tenders for the CEO from the previous reading of the papers. What is the right way to address it? Shouldn't we feel comfortable with the control environment before we increase any potential limits, or is this increasing limits is really that the right thing to do if we have concerns? So hopefully you understand where I'm coming from with that.
Mr. Jorgensen, Mr. Parker.
Sorry, Murray, would you like to answer that, or would you like me to?
Thanks, Bill.
I guess just probably wanted to seek some clarity around the question. So we've obviously got 2 issues here. We've got the recent increase to the Act and regulations in terms of the tender threshold, which has gone from $150,000 to $250,000. And then we've got our delegated authority and our systems and processes internally whereby council approve obviously the thresholds that the CEO can accept a tender. I'm assuming that you're relating to the latter, is that correct?
Yeah, so yes, if I can draw your attention to just looking at page 9 of the papers, and in the risk-based audits it has tenders there, and it basically describes how tenders is a high-risk area proposed for the internal plan for 2021. As a result, the CEO delegation to approve tenders increased in June 2018 to a value of $1 million. And Risk Committee has requested that more audits on tenders be undertaken. So, so I guess it just struck me as, on one hand, we are saying that we've disclosed a high-risk area and we've increased the delegation of the CEO. On the other hand, we're saying we're doing more audits on the tenders. Is that reflective of concerns around the controls that we have around that? And if so, then really should that have been increased $2 million?
Look, I'm happy to answer that in addition to what Bill Parker's just mentioned. It has been a high risk area. It's an area that I think our procurement team has made good progress in some checks and balances. we have indicated that we want more audits on the tenders to be undertaken to manage that risk. So I'm quietly confident that we've got better checks and balances. However, if there is any hurdles that an audit and risk committee wanted us to jump over to prove that before amending anything, I don't think it would drastically affect our business if it was amended. It just means there may be some delays and more items need referral to council. But at this stage, if I was asked for a recommendation, I think number one, everything has to be approved and budgeted for. So the first check and balance is really through council anyway. We do have strong now internal checks on the audits, and we have far better contract management in relation to this. But, you know, that's what an audit and risk committee is here to do, is assess that risk.
Thanks, Mr. Jorgensen. That actually adds the flavour, I think, to that comment I was seeking.
Yeah, and if I could, just one final comment. Since the report, when tenders were a high risk, we implemented a number of changes. In our current risk management plan, it's identified as a medium risk. So that's not in the report.
Thank you very much for that comment. I'm comfortable on that basis. Did you have any other questions, Mr. Morich?
No, Chair, that's it for me.
Thank you. So I have an observation. A note on attachment 8.2b, which places the proposed audit schedule program for 2020-2021. It does identify the last 3 years and the next 3 years proposed. So I would just like to highlight for the next version of the forward plan for forward years that we need to keep on top of the purchasing issue, and we also need to keep on top of the asset management. So in purchasing, there's no proposed audit in the next 3 years, and in asset management, that's been pushed out to 2022-2023. So for the record, I'd ask that just be noted and taken into account on the basis of those two areas for forward auditing. Thank you. So we have the audit plan for next year. Is there any further discussion on that? If not, I'll put the motion by show of hands. All those in favour? Nil against, and the motion's carried. Moving to item 8.3, this relates to the outstanding audit recommendations. The motion is as follows: that the Audit and Risk Committee receives the report of outstanding audit April 2020 and accepts the extended timeframes for completion of action to address the outstanding audit recommendations. Do I have a mover for that motion?
Yes, Chair, I'm happy to move.
Thank you, Mr. Morich, and I'll second from the floor. We can now move to discussion. Do you have any questions or comments on that item?
Yes. Just an observation. The role of internal audit and having a matrix in terms of its findings and where those to be addressed sets really the risk appetite of the entity. And I note that there's probably a high number of findings there that have been asked to be delayed. Now, I appreciate there's been some certain rationale for each one there, but in terms of the number of findings that are being sought to be delayed, I think doesn't set a very good tone or doesn't reflect very well. I think it is important and incumbent that when management commit to timelines that they work towards, and very much as an exception that if they're not met, then yes, they can be considered for exception. But I certainly just wanted to make those comments here because I didn't want us to be seen to be rubber stamping an automatic extension to a large number of the findings, because it does really undermine a lot of the audit efforts in the first place of really having a risk rating on the audits.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morris. I think further to that, especially a number of the high risk ratings, they do relate to the contract management review, tender process, yes, those are the main two. But I do note that the issues are being addressed by the procurement transformation process. So I thought it might be useful if we asked management to update us on that process, and based on the work, whether they believe that the revised timelines, which are now June 2020, will be met with confidence. Mr. Parker?
Sorry, thanks, Chair. If it's okay, I'll ask either Michael Kent or Darren Turner to respond to that particular question.
Thank you.
Hi, Darren Turner, Strategic Procurement Lead. Yes, the timelines I'm confident we will still meet. There has been some challenges, obviously, with working from home and training of some of the staff, but I'm still confident we will meet those targets.
Thank you. Anything to add, Mr. Kent or others? If not, did you have any other questions, Mr. Morich?
No, that's it, Chair.
Well, thank you for making that point. I think that's particularly relevant with respect to our oversight role for these audit recommendations, and ensuring that we operationalise the implementation. So on the basis of the motion that's been read into the record, could we have a show of hands for all those in favour? Nil against, and the motion's carried. Thank you. Moving to item 8.4. This relates to the Internal Audit Plan 2019-20, the Payment Vouchers Review April 2020. And there's an attachment relating to this, the Payment Vouchers Review Report. The recommendation is that the Council approves the Payment Vouchers Review April 2020, completed as part of the Internal Audit Plan 2019-2020. Do we have a mover for that motion, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to move.
Thank you, Mr. Morris, and I'm happy to second from the Chair. Is there any discussion on that item, please, Mr. Morris?
Yes, so I understand that I see there's two medium findings, and a lot of the management comments around those are around that these will be addressed as part of the purchase to pay review and some of the changes that are occurring. Nonetheless, it does be a little bit concerning. I mean, there's a large amount there that are currently used for these payment vouchers, 1.8 million, I think, reading the report, and there's a certain degree of non-compliance in there in terms of the use of those vouchers. So I'm just interested whether, and I'd like to hear from management what their perspective is of how comfortable they are at the moment in terms of any misuse of those obviously, the audit has picked up certain degrees of non-conformances in there, but given the fact that we're saying, well, this is, will be looked at and we'll hold it instead until some of the fundamental changes are going to occur, how comfortable are we in the interim given those payment vouchers?
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Further to that, there are the two findings, both of medium, so quite significant. Mr. Jorgensen or Mr. Parker, would you be able to direct us as to who could best answer this question?
Through you, Chair. Bill, can you nominate the appropriate person? I know there's been a lot of stakeholders involved in this one, internal ones.
There certainly has. Thank you, Murray. I might firstly refer to Aloha in terms of the key staff that she's been working with on that particular issue, because I know there has been a number of members within the finance team that have been working through that. So we might refer there and then to the most appropriate officer, if that's okay, please, Murray.
Thank you.
Perhaps I can answer. Sorry,
Ms. Jody?
Yes, the internal, Mario Kelly, internal auditor. There's been a number of internal stakeholders that we engaged with in relation to this review. There's been a manager of finance, the senior financial accountant, the senior management accountant, the accounts payable officer. In particular,
Mr. Jody, I'm very sorry, but I'm finding it very difficult to hear you. Are you able to speak up, or if?
Yes, okay. The key stakeholders that we dealt with for this review are primarily the manager of finance and the senior financial accountant. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so the manager of finance was one of the principal parties that we dealt with.
Thank you. Mr. Parker, was there anyone else you wanted to direct that question to answer the specific?
Yeah, I think I'd like to refer to either Reshma, the manager of finance, or Sarah Gosling, please, in our finance team to answer either of those questions.
Yeah.
Reshma, did you want to answer, or I'm happy to if you would like me to?
Thank you very much, Ms. Gosling. Did you hear the question?
I did. Just you would like some comment on the non-conformities sort of identified. I think there's a couple of things to comment on there. The procedure, I think that one of the main findings from the auditors was that the procedure had not been reviewed recently, and I would like to raise the awareness of the fact that occasionally we have things that need to be paid, such as bond refunds, which are not actually specified within the procedure and are not paid through invoice. So by reviewing the procedure and ensuring that all payments that are not through invoice are picked up in that, or understanding what needs to be covered by that payment process, I think we need to actually review the procedure as the main item coming out of this review. The large repayments are generally the loan repayments that contributes to the significant value going through.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's mostly small amounts going through on payment vouchers.
Sorry, through you, Chair. So, Ms. Gosling, if I could just ask, there's a bit of a chicken egg issue here. So one is, is the procedure right? And then we need to make these payments, or the other one is really, well, procedure's wrong and we need to adjust the procedure. I would think when we have those large payments, is that something which we're looking to take out of this payment voucher process and put into another process which has probably more controls around it? Is that where we're heading with this?
Sorry. basically anything that we can get on an invoice, we will process on invoice using a purchase order. Some of the payments, one of the payments identified by the audit was there's probably some confidential stuff that I can't speak of here, which I can feed back later.
Well, that's right. We'll just note that it was a confidential.
Okay. As I say, the large payments tend to be the loan repayments, which we don't get an invoice for. The other large ones, Reshma, I don't know whether you can remember any of the other large ones that would have gone through there.
Payments to staff superannuation fund, was that one?
That was the one that I thought, wasn't sure whether that was confidential or not, but this was where there was a contractor and we needed to pay superannuation for the contract, and that doesn't go through payroll, and they raise an invoice for us with that, so we had to do that through a payment voucher. I don't think that had ever happened for the city before, so it was a new payment, so it wasn't picked up by the payment voucher.
All right. So, Mr. Morris, does that answer your questions?
Half answers. It gives you more clarity, I guess, around why some of those occur. I guess where we don't have invoices that are generated, I guess I'll make an observation that it'd be preferable for those types of payments to be done through a PO type process rather than a purchase voucher process, just given the extra layers of controls that exist around that. So I'll make an observation, just that when that is being considered as part of that future work that's still to be done, that can be considered, because certainly these types of issues should only be for really small value items, not for large value items, given the less controls that apply.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Thank you very much. Are there any further questions on that item?
No, thanks, Chair.
No, thank you. So mine just related to the timing since it's been reviewed, which was 2015. So obviously ready for a new review. So we'll put the motion. All those in favour? And nil against, and the motion's been carried. Thank you. Moving to item risk management quarterly report, item 8.5. This can be close the meeting to the public. Mr. Morris, did you wish to discuss this item and hence requiring to pass a motion to close the meeting to the public?
No, there's nothing confidential I wish to discuss.
So neither do I. Thank you very much. We'll move then to the item 8.5. And I'll put the motion that the Audit and Risk Committee approves the risk management update for May 2020. Do I have a mover for that motion?
Thank you, Chair. Happy to move.
And I'll second from the chair. Was there any discussion at all noting the confidentiality of that motion, Mr. Morris?
Yep, thank you, Chair. I had two questions. First of all, before I get into the questions, the observation, I think I can see there's been a fair bit of work in the risk area in terms of reformulating and re-establishing the framework going forward, and I understand that the risk framework is coming up to the next meeting. The first question I have is, do we have a risk policy? And the second question I have is, CGR, we're saying that there's still a few things that need to be done before we can have it fully operational for the risk and audit items. I'd just like to have a date by which that will be done, because it appears to be an item that seems to be dragging on in terms of it being fully implemented. So I'd just like to understand a firmer date on CGR.
Mr. Parker or Ms. Jorgensen?
Probably Chris Noble, the Corporate Strategy and Risk Advisor Chair, is the best person to answer that particular question.
Thank you.
Hi guys. Yep, so through the chair, we've kind of in a bit of a position where CGR, the implementation of CGR is really dependent on the chart of accounts process. So the stability in our organisational structure in the back end of our HIRS system is kind of the platform that CGR has to use to kind of be able to bring our risks on board in an online fashion. So at this stage, we're still looking at sort of the start of the next financial year. There may be little teething concerns, I'm not sure. But in the interim, we've introduced a bit more of an Excel-based process so that we can continue with the risk management process without being sort of hamstrung by the actual system itself. In terms,
yes, thank you.
In terms of the policy,
yeah.
Yep. So the city does have a current risk policy. Now, as part of the whole review and kind of reformulation process we're going through in terms of risk management, that will be an area that we'll look at as well as part of that overarching framework. So we're yet to kind of unpin some of that information, but we'll definitely be taking a look at that, and that will probably come to you in that same fashion in the next meeting.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say I'd like to consider the policy and the framework to be considered as one, because there'll be a lot of overlap between the two. And if I can just make an observation as well, with the risk policy, the articulation of risk appetite within that would be beneficial as well, given that I see the next agenda item of the fraud corruption, for example, there's a degree of risk appetite articulation within that as well. So for it to be articulated in that risk policy in the first instance would be beneficial.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That's it, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moses. So just to be clear, is that item coming to the next meeting? Was that what was indicated?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It will be recorded in the minutes, Chair, that this item will be presented to the next meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much. So put the motion. All those in favour? Nil against, and the motion's carried. We'll now move to item 8.6, which relates to the policy on fraud and corruption control. The motion is that the council receives the draft council policy fraud and corruption control as detailed in attachment 8.6A, and 2, agrees to initiate a 21-day public consultation on the draft council policy fraud and corruption control. Do I have a mover for that motion?
Yes, Chair, happy to move.
Thank you, Mr. Morrish, and I'll second from the chair. Any discussion, Mr. Morrish?
Thanks, Chair. Just one question I had. In the policy, it has a comment in there that the Audit and Risk Committee will review the performance of the Fraud and Corruption Control Plan annually. I was just interested to understand how that function would be performed.
Sure. Thank you. Through the chair, firstly, I'd just like to apologise. We had every intention that the policy and plan would come to the committee as one item. The plan is significantly progressed, but we've probably just fallen a couple of weeks short. So I apologise for that. It will absolutely be presented to the next meeting. In terms of the actual plan itself and the frame that we're basing it upon, continual measurement of your performance against the plan is obviously essential. So essentially what we'd be seeing is an annual review against that plan and the criteria within the plan to obviously assess the city's performance, and that would be reported back to the committee to ensure that you're satisfied with the city's performance against that plan.
Does that answer your question, Mr. Morrish?
Yes, thanks, Chair.
Mr. Parker, does it make sense then that we consider this item now and then the plan later, or should we defer this item to be considered together if that's what you intended?
Well, I guess what we were looking for, Chair, in terms of we clearly wanted to demonstrate to the committee that this was a focus and that we had been working on a body of work. I think when we initially looked at putting a plan up in isolation, it really did lack the rigour and the authority that a policy has, and a couple of those guiding principles around the CEO's responsibility for the plan, the annual review to assess against performance. So there's a couple of key things there we wanted to encapsulate within a policy document. I certainly think the policy can essentially be a standalone and that overarching document. So I think the two can be approached separately. My only concern would be if we deferred this, because of the new policy framework and the 21-day advertising process, it may delay the implementation of the plan. So in an ideal world, and if the committee's happy, I'd love to see this particular policy adopted tonight. It provides the overview and the framework. It allows us to finalise the plan. But while that's all happening, we're able to advertise and go out to the community, get that feedback and go through that policy framework process. So I think it can work, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Well, it's very, I mean, it's succinct and to the point. It'll be interesting to see what responses we have on the consultation on it, because it would be hard to disagree with it, I think.
Just on that, Chair, if I can, at the last meeting, we did undertake essentially a best practice review of all of the fraud and corruption control plans that different local governments had in place, to see if we could essentially take something that had been prepared and applied at the City of Perth. But in doing that, we decided that given the complexity of the city's business compared to some of the other local governments we looked at, that we certainly did need a standalone plan that really looked after our business, given its uniqueness. So it has taken a little bit longer, but I can assure you that we'll end up with a far better product. So I'm looking forward to that being delivered in the next few weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. If there's no further questions or comments on this, Mr. Murray, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? By a show of hands, thank you. And nil against, and the motion's carried. Moving now, that concludes section 8 of the meeting. Moving to item 9, Mr. Jorgensen, have any notices of motion been received? You're on mute. Thank you.
Shame you can't lip read, Chair. Anyway, the answer to your good question was no.
Thank you. And I have one more question. Well, a couple more. Have any items of general business been received under item 10?
No, Chair.
And are there any items for consideration at a future meeting?
Only the ones that you nominated just in tonight's meeting.
Thank you very much. So if there's no further business, could I please thank everyone for their attendance, especially the staff who have made themselves available to answer questions. Thank you very much for your attendance, everyone, and it is now my responsibility to declare the meeting closed. Good evening, everyone.